Now I forgot to start the recording here. Now I have to do that. Okay. Now, this particular lesson, we have to look at where it is. You know, it's part of our pattern as we study these. We're in the 9th chapter of Mark, which means we are fairly more than halfway through that part of the gospel that excludes the passion narrative, which begins in a few more chapters. So we're well into the Gospel of Mark now. And we have been seeing Jesus teaching. We have been seeing Jesus doing miracles, signs. We have seen Jesus healing. And now his disciples have been following him for a while. And now they're getting a little, their egos are starting to get a little big. Let's put it that way. Because they have been with Jesus all this time, and Jesus starts referring to them in a way that, you know, they are going to have to do this stuff, and, you know, that they will have the power they need from God to accomplish what God wants them to do. And of course, in typical Markan, you know, ideas, the disciples just don't get it. You know, these are rather thick-headed people. I'm not being nasty. I'm not trying to be pejorative. It's just the reality that we are they. You know, there's that great pogo. I don't know if you remember it. I mean, it's a long time ago now, but it was very popular for a long time. It's a frame from one of the pogo cartoon series. And it says, "We have met the enemy and they are us." You know, that sometimes we can be our own biggest obstacle to understanding the way of Jesus and living fully the way of Jesus. And it is of particular danger for us who are institutional people. By institutional people, I mean people who appreciate and love the institutional church. So, for example, we have our liturgies, and we have our polities, our way of organizing ourselves and making decisions. We have our ways of doing things to the point where, you know, it is partly a joke, but partly realistic to call these the 7 deadly words, kind of paralleling the 7 deadly sins. We never did it that way here. Or the converse of that, we've always done it that way here. You know, that we become hidebound in our way of doing things. And not only that, but we become a bit prideful about that, where we look at other denominations or other parts of the Christian church. And even worse, we look at the world around us and we start to say, you know, I don't understand why they don't come to church, or I don't understand why they don't get it. You know, it's that kind of thing. And that's when we become our own biggest obstacle to doing the work that Jesus has given us to do, as we say in the liturgy, as we say the final Thanksgiving at Eucharist, the one that we normally use. We're using a different one now for COVID reasons and so on. But, you know, send us out into the world to do the work that you have given us to do. You know, that reality sometimes gets overridden by much of our institutional concern. Not only our concern for, like, the buildings and so on, you know, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of resource to keep all that going. We all know that. We've all experienced that firsthand. But that we think that that's being church. And that we forget that without those things, we would still be the church. And in fact, the church's mission would not have changed. That all those things that we spend so much time and resource and energy on very often are the tools that we have been given to do the work that Christ has given us to do. Instead, we make them the ends. We make them not the means, but the ends of our life as a Christian community. Now, as the rector, I can appreciate that deeply, because the church, the institutional church of which we are a part, assigns that ultimate responsibility to me. In other words, when I was installed in the more traditional ceremony that we sometimes use, the keys are actually to the church building are given from the senior warden hands them over to the rector. And what is said at that point in time is basically that you are now responsible for these things. That's true. Then also a stole or a set of vestments is handed over from one person to the rector. Then a Bible is handed over. A copy of the Constitution and canons of the church and the diocese are handed over. These kinds of things. So that basically the rector is, as I was sort of talking about earlier before we started Bible study, the buck stops here. But it's not that the person sitting in that seat has to do all these things. What it is that person sitting in that seat is responsible for all those things to make sure that they are done. And of course, that varies then with the size of a parish. It varies with the size of the community, with the amount of resources the community has, and so on and so forth. So we can get really caught up, including the ministry of the church. The leaders can get caught up in some of this other stuff and forget about the reality that the core call to discipleship is about service to one another. This is important. This is what this passage of Mark is about. And from a theological point of view, this is the idea that parallels what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper, like on what we celebrate on Maundy Thursday. When he takes off his cloak, he takes the basin and the towel, and he puts on an apron, and he bends down and he starts to wash the disciples' feet. And, then there's that dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Well, Lord, if you're going to wash my feet, not my feet, but my whole body as well. And Jesus says, you don't need that. In that sense, we have already been washed clean in the waters of baptism by our statement of faith and our openness of heart to become part of this faith community and to live and to grow into the ways of Jesus. The foot washing piece of it is playing the role of the servant. Because as we talked about before, I know when we did study that portion of John for Maundy Thursday, we talked about how people's feet needed to be washed if you were a guest in someone's home, because you were traversing unpaved streets, and often part of the street there was a little gully on the side that was the sewer. So when you came into somebody's house, it was very customary to either wash your own feet, or in a somebody of more noble stature, a servant would wash your feet. That was part of hospitality. So that this notion of service, Jesus makes very clear in all of the Gospels that it is this service that is the binding force of the community. It isn't who is in charge. It's the service we render one to the other, and the service that the church renders to the world. That this is the binding force. This is the tether, if you will, or the spirit that holds us together. It isn't whether we have signed a paper or, a letter of transfer has been given in our name. I mean, all of those things are elements of the institutional church, but the ultimate test of our discipleship and our membership in the, broadly speaking, body of Christ is in our willingness to become servants of all. And you begin to understand that a bit more when we talk about, how the Christian church is to be a community built on love. We talk about how love is very hard. It's hard to love people you don't like, but you can always be a servant of someone, even if you don't like them. You can do the act of service. You can wash their feet. I mean, if somebody is coming into your home and you're the host, basically is what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper, and you've invited this person, maybe even out of social obligation because you really don't like them, and they come in and they have dirty feet, you're going to wash your feet for no other reason than you want a clean house. So it's that kind of thing that, we sometimes will bear with or undergo a burden, even when it's not comfortable, to make sure that that person is taken care of, that they can join into the fellowship to which they have been invited. One of the things we talk about in the Episcopal Church is that we are a church of radical inclusion, which means that we can be as disparate as East is from West, even on theological opinions. But as long as we hold some key things together, namely the statements of the creeds, and we believe in the sacramental system in which we participate, that no matter how different we can all eat at the same table. And we share the same meal. That those other things do not get in the way. And if they do get in the way, there is a problem. That is actually the encroachment of the evil one doing that. So we could say it's evil or it's sinful, whatever, but anything to divide the community is a problematic issue. Now, that's not saying we're going to not have arguments, and there are times when I don't want to really associate with that person, kind of thing. But it can't stay that way. That's really the issue. Soon. You're muted.
No, I'm sorry. I was just moving.
Oh, the way you had your hand up, I thought you wanted to say something.
No, okay, no.
That is a gesture you make when you want to say something. I don't know if you realize it. I'm learning you learn these things on Zoom because you see people right up there,
But,
I know when Tom is kind of like thinking, I can see the expression on his face, or George leans forward a little bit. He wants to say
I want to say something. I would like to say something.
Okay, go ahead then, George.
Well, Betty and I arrived at St. Luke's in 1973, about 2 weeks ahead of Jerry Richards' arrival. And Betty joined the Episcopal Church when she married me. And my experience in the Episcopal Church was that of the lowest of the low, at a period when churches were ranked by high church and low church.
Mm-hmm.
I never, until I came to St. Luke's, experienced anything that was of high church nature. We were greeted with such a warm welcome that I looked at Betty and I said, well, this is a lot different than what I grew up with, but these are really nice people, and I think we should stay here. But I would have discussions with Jerry about how I felt sometimes uncomfortable when we would go through these elaborate rehearsals for the so-called altar party. And we would rehearse it over and over again, and the choir would sit there wondering, when is this going to be over? And he was always very gracious, but it continued, and we just got accustomed to it. And during the long period that we were without a rector, we didn't have those things because we would take any priest, no matter how high or how low. And I knew every priest for miles around here because I was calling them up to come on in because we didn't have an interim. And I got into a discussion not too long ago where I talked about this experience. And I said, I was not accustomed to the trappings of high church liturgy. The
Mhm.
person I was talking to got extremely angry at me. Why are you mad at me? Trappings. And I said, have you got a better word? I didn't mean to upset anybody. To me, I thought it was a perfectly descriptive word. And since that time, plus what we're going through now with the virus, we don't have really the resources to have an elaborate liturgy like we used to have. And it has transformed us into something more basic, more approaching to what I grew up with. And so that I think what we have been through was a period of sort of leavening for St. Luke's, and that we discovered that actually we can get along with anybody and we can get along with almost anything.
Mhm.
And I think that's progress.
Yes, yes. In fact, that is kind of sort of the point of where we're going with this, is that that's why I went into that stuff at the beginning about what you called trappings, for example. It's not just the trappings of the liturgy. There's all kinds of other stuff too, that, whoever you were speaking with, I have a feeling I know who that might be, that that word it was seen as pejorative, but you're right, it's a description, it's a descriptive word that says that while these things can be lovely and wonderful and help us actually sort of experience a dimension of religious life, the mysticism and all that sort of things, that's why we use incense and all that kind of stuff, but they're not the essentials.
Yeah.
And that's what Jesus is doing in this passage when when the disciples are arguing among themselves as to who is the greatest. They're doing what Peter did just last week, or is it 2 weeks ago now, when he says, when Jesus asked them, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, well, you are the Christ. And Jesus said, oh, fine, good, you get it, but then Jesus starts to say what the Christ has to undergo, that he will be tried and mocked and, spat upon and beat and even crucified. And then Peter says, oh, no, 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 that's not going to happen. That can't happen to you. And then Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking in terms of the world, not of the things of God. And I think what you're describing is just what Jesus is trying to get at with the disciples in this lesson, this passage, is that you have to stop thinking about the way the world organizes itself, about the things that the world counts as important, and realize that what is truly important about the way I am trying to teach you is that this way is the way of humble service, and that is what will bind you together. Authoritarian power can compel people to do things they don't want to do, but it doesn't ultimately bind people together. The binding part happens as a matter of heart. And I think that Jesus' key insight in his teaching in this is that service allows you to speak heart, as St. Augustine would describe it, heart unto heart, cor ad cor loquitur, that basic loquitur, that we basically speak heart unto heart. And that is where the spiritual bonds are created. And that is true in our prayer life with God, which is what Augustine was talking about, but is equally true when we talk about the binding force within the community we call the church. And so it is that service, one of the other, that in fact communicates this Spirit of God and the spirit of the kingdom. And too often, I think, particularly in the Episcopal Church, I went in my canon law class, and I think I may have mentioned this, Kathy, I think sometime in the Anglican Approaches class. I talk about how the church, as many churches did, we live in a particular society and we draw from that society. So the ideas that we have often come with the people we draw. And so when, the church needs something, then people draw on their experience. And so the Episcopal Church, like in the 1950s, the presiding bishop moved from being simply the president of the House of Bishops to being the CEO of the church. And we use those descriptions an awful lot. I used it already earlier today when I talked about, the ultimate responsibility for the temporalities of the parish and so on is the charge of the rector. That's why the rector presides over the vestries, because the rector is technically, legally speaking, the chief executive officer. But we even hear vestries described that way. How many of you have served on vestry when you were told, well, what is the vestry? Well, it's like the board of directors for the church. Well, that's a secular model. That's not an ecclesial model. That's not a biblical model. The biblical model is that you are the leaders within a community. You are the council of elders. And I don't mean old people, but I mean, the people who basically have been charged by the community with managing the affairs of the community in every element of its life. So it's not only about money and budgets and buildings. It's about catechesis and religious education and spiritual formation. It's about worship and liturgy. It's about all of the things we do as community. Those are the responsibilities of vestry. Not only to be the civil board of directors. Now, the problem is because we live in sort of a bifurcated life. For legal purposes within the secular realm, it is the board of directors. So it is ultimately responsible on those levels. And so we have to pay careful attention to those things. But at the same time, we live on a higher level where essentially the vestry is a council of elders. They are the primary advisors to the pastor. So that even the term rector, there's a very specific reason why we use the term rector in the Episcopal Church, and that is because we hold the bishop to be the prime pastor of the church, which is the diocese. A lot of people think of church, they think of their parish. In the theology of the Episcopal Church, the church is the diocese. It's not the parish. But the parish is kind of a subset of the diocese. And the rector, that term has a long history in church speak, that basically the rector serves in the place of another, and that other, in this case, is the bishop. That's why in some very old churches that have old furnishings, old configurations of furnishings, I should say, that often there is a chair that is reserved and no one sits in it in the sanctuary. And it is usually the most prominent chair. And that chair is actually the chairs to remind us that that's the bishop's chair. And
we had that for years.
Yeah. And that the bishop is the pastor, capital P, pastor, shepherd, if you will. That's why he has the I call it the party stick, but it's really, a shepherd's crook. His crozier is the sign of that pastoral office. So that, that's the kind of thing. And in fact, I've been looking at various things and how could we kind of redo that in our church? It's not part of the current configuration, but there was an opportunity for me to possibly get a bishop's chair, but it just didn't work out. And I looked at it carefully. It wasn't suitable for the, style of the design of our furnishings and so on. But that is, I think, one of the things that we need constantly to remind ourselves of is that we're not we have a secular arm of the church, but our primary focus is not that at all. It is creating the body of Christ. And there is only one head in the body of Christ, and that is Jesus Christ himself. Everyone else who has any authority in the church has that authority because it has been given to them, through apostolic succession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have all these sort of theological ideas, but by Christ. And so even in my role as rector, one of the things I am is pastor. And I sometimes say that to, because rector is one of those esoteric words that most people outside of our church don't understand. It's like all of the signage around the church talks about going into the nave. People who aren't Episcopalians, and even Episcopalians don't even know, what does that mean? No, it's the church building proper is what we're talking about. So, those are all going to be changed. Church, this direction. The nave is part of the church, along with the choir, spelled Quire, actually, in Old English, and the chancel, which is the spot, beyond the rail, up and where the apse is, that's where the altar is. So that those are all parts of the church, but we can get into our episco speak, sometimes I call it, and he's the rector. Well, often what I describe when I'm outside of Episcopal, and I'll say rector, or sometimes, well, I'm the priest and pastor of St. Luke's, but that's really my job, is to be the pastor, and to be, when we have more than one person involved in pastoral ministry on any level, Soon is our coordinator of pastoral care. Mary is the assisting priest for children, youth, and young adults, and so on, that I am the head pastor. That basically would be that idea, that ultimately, because I'm the rector, I serve in the stead of the bishop, and not in place of the bishop, but instead of the bishop. So that what happens is, that's why the bishop must approve. There's some legal things in there, civilly, yes, but the bishop must approve who the new rector is, because the rector speaks in the bishop's name. He's not strictly speaking a vicar of the bishop. That term, vicar. In England, my job is actually entitled vicar. So it's even clearer in England, in the Church of England, that the word vicar means you are doing something as the agent of another, and that the other is the bishop. So in our system, for a lot of historical reasons, that word vicar is reserved for a very narrow category of people. That's basically people who genuinely do act in the stead of the bishop, because the bishop has direct control over that parish for any number of reasons. It's a new plant, or it's a mission church, or it's an imperiled parish. And actually the vestry kind of disappears, all of that sort of thing. But when you have a rector, it's the same kind of thing. I basically have my authority because the bishop has given it to me. And that's true of any rector, not just of me, David Swifka, but any rector that is in the Episcopal Church. So we can all have these arguments about who's most important, and Jesus makes that very clear. The most important one is the least among you, because that's where your attention is supposed to be. Your attention isn't supposed to be focused on the person who's in charge. Your attention is to be focused on the person you need to serve the most. So it's on the most vulnerable, the least powerful, the person who has no influence and no money. That is the focus of service in the church. Now, are we always faithful to that 100%? No, but we can strive for that as an ideal, like everything. None of us is perfect, and no congregation is perfect. But as long as we keep in the right mindset, we will be moving in the right direction, and that's what we need to do. Comments? Insights?
Well, I think it's very important to get this explained to us every couple of years.
Well,
particularly as we hope new people come into the church and look upon their experience here. It is more complicated, but there are good reasons for it to be that way. And this kind of conversation that we're having um, helps me very much because it identifies where these ideas come from. And I
Mhm.
think that that's very important in why we are what we are.
Mhm. Mhm. Kathy?
I think it's also, I definitely agree with what George said, but I think maybe it's more than every couple of years. I think it should be a constant, or we need a constant reminder that our goal is not, uh, it's the goal of service.
Yeah.
Um, because, it tends to get, I can't say put off into a small, into a little place by itself, but, we're so busy patting ourselves on our backs that until COVID,
Yeah, yeah,
that we do things right, and
yeah, yeah.
that we tend to segments, and all of us at times tend to forget that there is a higher calling to do more service.
Right.
And
We tend to regulate this notion of service to the outreach people.
yeah,
That's the siloing of responsibilities that actually St. Luke's is very good at, I should say. And that I have made my singular mission to break down. If I do anything before I am no longer at St. Luke's, I'm hoping that I give to the next rector a community that is not siloed in these responsibilities. Because, we all have to take responsibility for a part because we can't do
Yeah.
everything. But we have to always see how the parts all fit together. And that's probably what we did not do well for a little while. Soon.
This isn't perhaps very helpful, and I need to go back and read about stewardship and the capital campaign, but I keep thinking that we need to make a connection between the dreams that we have for the capital campaign and how that will help us as we move forward with our concerns as for reaching out and our mission as a real church.
Right, right. In
Yeah.
fact, that's Tom can attest to this since he sits on that committee, that this is a reminder that is frequently given that all the projects we're talking about need to be tied to the mission and the ministry of the parish.
Mhm.
And a phrase that I've started to use, it was in the last newsletter, there are no vanity projects here.
Mhm.
None of the things we're thinking about are designed to just make us fancy or to make us look special. If we can do that in the process, fine. I mean, we should do everything we do. I think God calls us to do everything we do for the kingdom with excellence, that we don't do things in a shoddy manner. So that if we worship, we should worship in the best way we know how and with all the resources that we have for that. When we do our outreach, we need to not see it as a sort of an add-on, but rather the core of what we do. And so that needs to be represented in the way we even configure our buildings and so on, and access to buildings. And so, part of the projects, excuse me, that we've proposed relative to like redoing the kitchen in the fellowship hall. Some people are saying, well, the kitchen is just fine the way it is, it works just fine. Well, no, it doesn't when you really think about what we use those rooms for. And the fellowship, oh, we just need to clean it up a little bit. No, that's the room that we use the most for outreach. The people who are not parishioners, that's the room they see the most. And so it needs to be warm and welcoming and comfortable and not pretty in the sense of fancy, but clean and that they feel like, oh, this is special. It's not to make it special, to make us special, but rather to make the people that we invite into that space feel special. There is the difference, you see. So even the accessibility projects, relative to the tower doors and the little vestibule possibly for the parish hall, when it comes to the feasibility study, we may need to chop one or another of those off just because we can't afford everything. But at least we are looking at projects that are designed to forward the mission and the ministry of the parish. even the organ repair, because the organ is such a critical part. Music is a part of our outreach. We don't often see it that way, but it is. The lighting in the church that we're proposing, that is a way that people can feel, people who have difficulty seeing, that they feel comfortable, welcome, they can accomplish what they need to accomplish. And yeah, so we can make the church also look very nice again, so that it's warm, welcoming, and inviting, so that, and the people who appreciate art and architecture, just because it's art and architecture doesn't mean that it's ancillary. It is, the beauty of our buildings is part of our gospel preaching. Now, I often will use the phrase, I don't know if you notice how often I use this phrase, but worship God in the beauty of holiness.
Oh.
That's from Psalm 109. That phrase says that holiness itself is beauty. And so how do we communicate holiness but through things of beauty? So the way we worship, the architecture of the building, the way in which we do it can't look dirty or old or out of repair, all of those things, because then we're saying, well, it doesn't really matter. And so holiness doesn't really matter. They're all tied together. It's just that, we need to balance sort of and prioritize what we do. Tom.
Well, I would just observe that I think throughout these Bible studies, a recurring theme has been the service to others, particularly the least among us.
Mm-hmm.
And like today's lesson, for example, where Christ uses the child, who, as I understand at that time, was a pretty low level
Yes.
rank in the social structure.
Yes.
I think he deliberately did that in
Yep.
order to get his point across.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing I've really gotten out of these Bible studies, is that recurring theme of it's our duty to serve the least among us.
Yes. And in fact, to get back to a Bible study part, sort of the theme with this, the word that is used for, excuse me, so I have a reminder that free new meal starts in 30 minutes. No, it doesn't, but there it is. Where was I before I got that reminder? The word for child in Greek that is used here is pais. The English letters would be P-A-I-S. And that word is used interchangeably between child and servant. And that pais, the rank of the pais, is where we get the word pedagogical from, that sort of thing. That the child, you're right, was the lowest because they were expendable. Remember, again, this is a culture and an era where children were not respected the way they are today. One had, it was thought that you were blessed by God to have lots of children, because that means you could do a lot of work on your farm. Did a lot of hands. And also children died frequently at a very young age. And so you couldn't depend on them. I mean, not only couldn't, morally speaking, that's not their role, but you couldn't depend on them for the point of view that they may not be here tomorrow. And often children died as infants, and mothers and children often died in childbirth. It was a common phenomenon. So for Jesus to take a child, a pais, and take the child into his arms, it means that what is there, it means you literally wrapped his arms around him. We find that to be very comforting and very lovely, because that's the way we think of children. But that would have been highly unusual in Jesus' time. Why do you think, for example, in that passage where the children were bothering, quote unquote, bothering Jesus, and the disciples tried to chase them away? The disciples weren't being mean. The disciples were doing what was socially done in those days. That was simply what was normative. That, children should be seen and not heard, kind of thing. that basically put them over there, they're bothering the master. And it was Jesus who said that wonderful term, suffer the little children to come unto me, for just such is the kingdom of God. And that's in Matthew. So what we're talking about here is the very same thing. Jesus is taking the child and embracing the child, making the child part of his own reality, and saying, serve this one, and you will be serving me. And of course, we hear it in other ways, for example, at the Last Judgment with the sheep and the goats and all of that kind of thing. So you're right, Tom. Key insight there, that this is the constant theme. And if Jesus did anything in his teaching, quite apart from any kind of supernatural or divine inspiration that we see around this, Jesus was calling into question the social order of his day. It came about in terms of, I have a piece of dust in my eye, that it came about in terms of children, of women, of non-Jewish people, Gentiles. Notice how Jesus reaches across and always pulls them to himself. Translated into our modern idioms, basically, that means we have to constantly be reaching out to those that we or our society may count as the least and the lost, and be pulling them into ourselves. Instead, many places, many churches, many denominations, not only our own, will sort of see these people and say, our outreach work is on Thursday morning, come back then, rather than inviting them into the life of the community on the spot. Now, maybe, you can invite, people may not want to come. Maybe that's not why they're there. That's okay. But we can never be the ones who push them away. Now, can people abuse us for that? Yes. In fact, I have to deal with a situation about that very thing. But at the same time, in terms of the disposition of our hearts, we have to examine our consciences deeply whenever we do have to do that. If we have to push somebody away, it has to be for a good reason. And that is consistent with that conviction about the least and the lost. Kathy.
I'm thinking of an example of someone Bernie had to deal with when he was junior warden. That you had to set limits for a person.
Yeah.
Which was a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But he was creeping all the women out.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, that's something that's not the same thing we're talking about here.
Well, no, but what I was going to say is, and I don't, but at the same, he had other issues too. Yeah, I don't know if he was really, well, he was trying to find a woman, but
yeah,
or anything of the female sex. But that you have to, when you do it, you have to do it with pushing that person towards someplace where he can get help that he needs.
Yes.
And if you aren't willing to get some of the help, we can't. And I don't want to limit it, but we have to keep it that if you're not willing to accept any type of help like that, there's only, as painful as it is, there's only so much you can do.
Right. Well, service does not mean absolving the other person of responsibility. That is not what service means. Service means taking care of the fundamental needs of an individual so that they can hear the gospel. And if they reject the gospel, then fine, but they did it. You didn't push them away from it. Therein is the difference. Mm-hmm. So for example, when someone is abusive to someone, I have a responsibility as pastor to call that person out. It's sinful to do that. And one of my jobs is to keep people from sinning.
Yeah.
And we don't like to talk about that stuff anymore, but that's a serious thing. Can we
Well,
commit
because
sin? Absolutely. I can commit sin. I mean, I have.
we
That's
all
why
do.
I have a confessor to go to, when I am convicted in my heart that I did something that I shouldn't have done. So that not only do I say the general confession at mass, but, or morning prayer, but I turn around and then go, to my confessor and, work the grace of the sacrament. Now, yeah,
then-
so services, that doesn't mean accepting letting people walk over the top of you, is what I'm saying.
Well,
Yeah.
the reason why I mentioned that is because Bernie still feels very guilty and upset about this whole situation.
No, he was acting out of a responsible position. See, none of this stuff is easy,
No,
and it's not black and white. We can make it black and white, and some people do, and then they get very critical of the church. Excuse me. A lot of people who say, I have no tolerance for organized religion, blah, 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 blah. All this, basically, when you start talking to them, they're black and white thinkers. It has to be all this or all that, and nobody can be all this, so they want none of it. And sometimes it's a convenient excuse not to deal with the complexities of life, particularly from a religious perspective. Wow, that's a mouthful. But look at the disciples in this passage. They were arguing amongst themselves who was the greatest. I mean, these are the closest people to Jesus, and they still weren't getting it, and so Jesus takes the child as an object lesson to them and says, serve this one, and then you'll understand what I'm talking about. Don't think that this one's not important because he's a child or she's a child. Or that women, again, the position of women in that society. And the revolutionary things that Jesus was doing with that. We kind of think of it as, well, yeah, of course you would do that. And well, no, that wasn't the case right up until, maybe a century ago. I mean, look in our own secular society, how long did it take to give women the vote? Just to, have a control over who was controlling them.
yeah.
And that's still part of the argument about some of the, governmental policies and court rulings and all that stuff to this very day.
They couldn't even own property.
Oh, yeah.
They were married.
Right. So that, our sense of equality within the church, that radical equality that comes to us in baptism is part of also what Jesus is sort of, he's not talking about that because that's a much later developed theological concept. But the idea is rooted in this, is that ultimately we are all equal in God's eyes. I mean, St. Paul teaches that clearly. And it is one faith, one Lord, one baptism in, Christ Jesus. There's no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, et cetera, et cetera. And that radical equality demands that we take care of one another. Now, there's a big debate in the church, particularly if you get into the Johannine corpus, the gospel and the letters of John, as to whether that radical equality extends to people outside of the community of the church. When he says love one another, is he saying that to love one another within the church, within the community? Or is he saying that to the larger world? That's a debate in Scripture. What does Jesus mean when he says that? But clearly here, he is saying that service, love is one thing, that self, total self-giving love of agape is one thing. Service is something else. You're not giving up yourself in order to serve. In fact, I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was Maya Angelou, who said basically giving heals the soul of the giver. Just, ponder that for a bit. So, healing or service heals the soul of the one who serves in a very real way. Soon.
Actually, unfortunately, I have to go soon.
Yeah,
and
well, we're almost done. So yeah, we should all be going soon, but now that we're recording these and posting them, I have to keep, people aren't going to listen for 5 hours,
And sadly, I'm
So,
away this weekend too, so.
and I just want to make one last point, and that is that, we're finishing up pretty much our readings from the letter of James, and we haven't really focused on those per se. We did a couple times. We'll go back and look at those lessons too, and how consistent they are with what we talked about today. This notion, show me your faith and I will show you my works. If one among you is without food and you say, go on your way, be well fed, what good is there in that? All these kinds of admonitions that James is giving to the nascent Christian community is very much a part of what James, it's thought the Apostle James, learned from Jesus. So with that in mind, I will bid you adieu.
Can I add an extra quick
Sure, real quick.
comment? Just from my limited knowledge of John, quite a few of his miracles were done outside of the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
Which, to me, that kind of leads that he was including everybody. But
well, no, the question is about this self-sacrificing love, this agapic love.
Okay.
That's where the question is. Is that
Okay.
something that is the binding force within a community, or is this something that we have to do for the entire world?
entire world. Okay.
Jesus
Yeah.
did it for the entire world, so we believe, but in the sense that eventually the idea is so that all can come to him. All can be incorporated into Christ. And once you're incorporated in Christ, you're in the church, so you need to love one another, so
Yeah.
that's sort of the dynamic we're talking about.
And what word did you use for child in Greek?
Pais, P-A would be pi, alpha, iota, sigma. See, Kathy took biblical Greek from the Stevenson School, so I can give her the number.
Yeah.
I also know how far down the variant list we are when we get to mu. So,
But yes, well, thank you, because I thought child was technon.
yeah, well, technon is that's the hand working with the hands,
Okay.
the handiman. Yeah, the technon.
Well, they also have tech and.
Well, they use it variously. It's about the
Okay,
translation. That's
Yeah.
it's always the question about the translation.
That is true. Yeah, because we had technon as child.
Yeah.
And a different word for servant that I don't
Doulos.
probably.
Yeah, but there are various words that are used, but yeah. Okay, so folks, take care. We'll see you. Actually, will I see you? I will not see you next week, because next week I will be, I don't know what time of day, but I will be under the knife again.
Oh,
It's really not a knife. It's just this little tiny instrument that goes in my eye. I'm having the left cataract removed, so that'll be Thursday. So we'll see you in 2 weeks then.
All right, good luck with that.
Good luck.
Thanks. Thank you. This one's been great so far. So great. Take care.
Bye-bye.